H1, Alien Commander slapped a Deathworlder. 5 seconds later, the galaxy saw his head roll. H2, Part 1, The Delegation That Should Have Gone Differently. The ship was so large that it blocked out the star behind it. Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Cole stood at the viewport of the small human shuttle and looked at the Sovereign Meridian for a long moment without speaking. He had seen pictures of it before. Pictures did not do it justice. The Conclave flagship was built from dark metal and pale stone, and it stretched across the sky like a small moon that someone had decided to arm. Lights moved along its surface in slow, crawling lines. Hundreds of smaller ships docked and undocked from its sides, like insects moving around a sleeping animal. Aaron turned away from the viewport and straightened his collar. "Tell me again," he said quietly, "why they picked me for this." Captain Diane Farrow, sitting across from him with her arms folded and her eyes closed, said, "Because you speak 4 alien languages and you haven't started a war yet." "Yet," Aaron said. "Yet," she agreed, and opened one eye. She was not a large woman. That was the first thing most people noticed about her, and it was also the first thing that got them into trouble. She was medium height, lean, and quiet in the way that certain animals are quiet. Not because they are calm, but because they are always ready. She had short brown hair and a scar along her jaw that she never explained. She had been assigned to Aaron 6 months ago as his personal security detail, and in that time she had said very little, observed everything, and once, in a corridor outside of Okari Embassy, discouraged 3 large armed guards from searching Aaron's bag by doing nothing more than standing still and looking at them. Aaron respected her deeply. He was also a little afraid of her, which he considered a reasonable and healthy response. The third member of their team was Dr. Owen Briggs, the xenolinguist. He was sitting at the small table near the back of the shuttle, with 4 different translation devices spread out in front of him, and an expression on his face like a man who had just realized he had forgotten something important. "Owen," Aaron said. "I know about the Draveshi," Owen said, without looking up. "I didn't say anything about the Draveshi. You were going to." Owen picked up one of his devices and squinted at it. "High Commander Varrock will be in the chamber. He controls 6 of the 12 votes that matter. He has never spoken directly to a human before, and his species considers physical proximity to a lesser species to be an insult." He finally looked up, "So don't stand too close to him." "I wasn't planning to." "Also don't speak first, and don't show your teeth when you smile. And if he offers you the formal silence gesture, don't mirror it. In their culture, mirroring is aggression." "Owen?" "Yes." "Breathe." Owen breathed. Aaron looked out the viewport again as their shuttle began its approach to the Sovereign Meridian's docking bay. He thought about the briefing documents he had read on the flight out here, thick folders of notes about the asteroid belt in the disputed zone, the mineral deposits inside it, the 17 different species that had claims on it, and the particular reason humanity needed access to it. The rare elements in that belt could reduce the production cost of human ship engines by 40%. That meant more ships, that meant more reach, that meant eventually a stronger voice in rooms like the one he was about to walk into. He was not naive enough to think this would be easy. He was also not the kind of man who let that stop him. The docking bay of the Sovereign Meridian was enormous and cold and smelled of something faintly metallic. Hundreds of species moved through it in organized streams, and Aaron and his team were guided through corridors wide enough to drive a truck through, past walls that showed slow-moving images of stars and map systems, toward the central chamber of the conclave. The chamber itself was a circle. That was the first thing Aaron noticed. Every seat was arranged in rings around a central floor, rising up on all sides, so that every species could look down at whoever was speaking. The ceiling was open to a dome of transparent material, and through it a distant star burned in steady gold light. The chamber held perhaps 300 beings at full capacity. Today, it was nearly full. Aaron walked to the human delegation's assigned space, a narrow platform near the inner ring, modest in size, which told him everything he needed to know about how humanity was regarded here. Observer status, tolerated, not taken seriously. He looked around the room slowly, as Diane took her position behind him and Owen pulled up his translation interface. He saw the Kreth first, tall, multi-limbed, with narrow heads that moved in small quick tilts as they communicated with each other in low clicks. Then the Thulans, visible only as soft clouds of bioluminescent gas inside sealed containers. Then the Vokari, scaled and long-limbed, watching everything with their wide lateral eyes. And then, across the chamber, the Draveshi delegation. They were built like something between a soldier and a monument, broad-shouldered, heavy, gray-skinned, with layered armor that seemed to be partly decorative and partly functional. They sat in the largest delegation space in the chamber, because of course they did. And at the center of their group, elevated slightly above his subordinates, sat High Commander Varek. He was older than Aaron had expected. His skin was darker gray at the edges, and his eyes, 3 of them, arranged in a shallow triangle, were the color of old copper. He wore no expression that Aaron could read. He sat with the relaxed stillness of someone who had never once in his life felt the need to prove anything, because the universe had always agreed with him before he could even raise the question. He glanced at the human delegation once. Once was apparently enough. He looked away. The session opened with formal language that Owen translated in a low murmur into Aaron's earpiece. Territorial claims, resource allocation, voting procedures. Aaron listened carefully, waited for his position on the speaker list, and when his name was finally called, he walked to the center of the floor, stood in the speaking position, and began. He spoke in clear, measured language. He had prepared for this. He had the numbers, the legal framework, the precedent from 3 similar rulings. He was 2 sentences into his 3rd paragraph when a voice cut across the chamber. "This does not require our time." Aaron stopped. Varrock had not moved from his seat. He had not raised his voice. He had simply spoken in the flat tone of someone turning off a light. "The human claim has no standing," Varrock continued. "Their ships cannot hold the belt. Their technology cannot extract it efficiently, and their species has been among the stars for less than a century." He paused. "They are here as a courtesy, not as a voice." The chamber was quiet. Aaron stood still on the floor. He kept his expression neutral. He took a slow breath and opened his mouth to respond. Varrock rose from his seat. He walked down from the Dravishi platform. He walked across the chamber floor. The other species watched him. No one spoke. His footsteps were heavy and even. He stopped in front of Aaron and looked down at him from nearly a full head of height. And then slowly and deliberately, he raised one large open hand and brought it across Aaron's face. Not a strike meant to injure, a strike meant to say something. In Dravishi culture, it meant, you are not a person. You are something owned. You are beneath the threshold of formal acknowledgement. It meant livestock. The sound of it carried through the chamber. Every recording device in the room was running. Aaron's head had turned with the impact. His cheek was red. He stood very still for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he raised his head and looked at Varrock. Diane had not moved, but something about her had changed. The way a held breath changes things, or the way the air changes just before lightning. Aaron said quietly, in flawless Dravishi, "You should not have done that." Varrock smiled. It was the last comfortable moment he would have for a very long time. Alien Commander slapped a Deathworlder. 5 seconds later, the galaxy saw his head roll. Part 2. 5 seconds the galaxy will never forget. Varrock's smile lasted exactly as long as it took Diane Farrow to move. She did not shout. She did not warn him. There was no dramatic pause, no declaration, no moment where she announced what she was about to do. One moment she was standing 5 feet behind Aaron with her hands at her sides. The next moment, she was not standing there anymore. She was already moving. The two Draveshi guards stationed at Varrock's flanks were large. That was not an opinion, it was simply a measurement. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, each of them armored from shoulder to ankle, with reaction times that their species was genuinely proud of. They had been trained for decades. They had stood in rooms full of dangerous beings for their entire careers. They did not stop her. The first guard reached for her. She was already past him. She used his own reaching arm as a rail, redirected herself around him without slowing, and by the time he had processed that she was no longer where his hand expected her to be, she was already past the second guard too. Later, the Conclave's medical staff would review the footage and produce a written report. The report noted in careful and confused language that the movement patterns she used were biomechanically inconsistent with expected outputs for a creature of her recorded mass and height. One of the reviewing physicians, a Vokari specialist with 40 years of experience, reportedly looked at the footage 3 times and then quietly closed his screen and did not submit a comment. Varrock turned. That was his mistake. Turning meant that his primary limb, the dominant arm, the one he had used to strike Aaron, was rotating toward her. She caught it. She stepped into his space, the way water steps into a crack, finding the angles that armor does not cover. And she took his arm and moved it in a direction it was not built to go. The sound Varrock made was not a roar. It was something smaller than a roar. Something surprised. His knees hit the chamber floor. It was not a fall. She had not thrown him. She had simply applied enough specific pressure to the correct places that his body had made a structural decision, and the decision was down. He was kneeling. High Commander Varrock, who had conquered 43 worlds, who had never once in his life been physically subordinated by any being in any room, was on his knees on the floor of the Galactic Conclave's central chamber. Diane held the position for exactly 1 breath. Then she stepped back. She released his arm. She turned and walked back to her place behind Aaron. She adjusted her collar. She looked forward. That was all. The chamber did not breathe. 300 beings from dozens of species sat frozen in their seats. The only sound was the faint hum of the ship's systems and the distant faint noise of Varrock slowly getting back to his feet. His guards helped him. He did not look at them. He did not look at Diane. He looked at the floor in front of him with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the ground he had been standing on his entire life was made of something thinner than he thought. Aaron turned back to the podium. "As I was saying," he said in a calm and even voice, "the human claim to the asteroid belt is supported by 3 separate precedents in conclave resource law, and I would like to walk through them now." No one interrupted him. Owen, standing at the edge of the delegation platform with his translation devices clutched to his chest, was cycling rapidly through 17 different cultural and legal databases. His hands were moving fast. His face was pale. When he found what he was looking for, his face went a shade paler. He waited until Aaron had finished speaking and stepped back from the floor. Then he leaned in close and spoke very quietly into Aaron's ear. "We have a problem," he said. "Define problem," Aaron said, without moving his face. "What Diane did, physically subduing a commander in open session, it doesn't read as assault under Draveshi law." Owen kept his voice low and controlled. "It reads as a formal declaration. There's an old tradition called the Varath. It's a dominance protocol. If a commander is physically subdued by a combatant of an opposing group in a witness setting, it is legally treated as the opposing group asserting species superiority. So we fight." Across the chamber, Varrock had finished listening to his subordinates. He sat straight. His 3 copper-colored eyes moved across the floor to where the human delegation stood, and he looked at them for a long moment with the focused, still attention of something that has decided what it is going to do. Then he raised one hand to the chamber speaker and requested the floor. The chamber granted it. He stood. "Under the Varath protocol," Varrock said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "I issue formal challenge to the human delegation. Their combatant acted against a Draveshi commander in open session. This will be answered in the arena. He looked directly at Diane. I will select my champion. They will select theirs. The contest will settle the question of standing. He sat back down. The chamber murmured. The Kreth delegation made a low clicking sound that Owen's device translated as good, finally. Every eye in the room turned to the human platform. Aaron straightened his jacket. He stepped forward to the speaker position. The chamber went quiet again. The human delegation accepts the challenge, he said. He stepped back. Owen immediately grabbed his sleeve. You didn't consult me, he whispered. Would your answer have been different? Owen thought about it. No, but I would have liked to be consulted. Aaron turned to Diane. She was looking straight ahead at the far wall of the chamber, with the same calm, steady expression she always had. He studied her profile for a moment. She did not appear troubled. She appeared the way she always appeared. As if she had already thought through every possible outcome, and had arrived at a place of simple, practical readiness. Diane, he said quietly. I heard, she said. Are you? Yes, she said. You didn't let me finish. You were going to ask if I was ready. She finally looked at him. The answer is yes. Aaron nodded slowly. Across the chamber, the recording devices were still running. Every angle, every moment, captured and already moving outward through the conclave's communication networks at the speed of transmitted signal. In 6 hours, what had happened in this room would reach every inhabited system in the known galaxy. In 12 hours, every species with an intelligence division would be pulling up every file they had ever made on humanity. And in 24 hours, a Volcari counselor named Jith would sit down at her desk with a cold drink and a growing sense of unease, open the oldest Earth files in the Conclave archive, and begin to understand, for the first time, exactly what kind of species had just walked through the door. Alien commanders slapped a Deathworlder. 5 seconds later, the galaxy saw his head roll. Part 3. The galaxy starts paying attention. The footage spread faster than the Conclave's official communication channels could manage. By the time the Sovereign Meridian's Administration Office issued a formal statement that the session had been paused pending legal review, the recording had already been viewed over 4 million times across 12 different species networks. By the end of the first day, that number had grown by a factor of 10. By the end of the second day, it had become the most viewed piece of footage in the recorded history of the Galactic Conclave's media archive. The galaxy was watching. Not all of it watched for the same reason. The Kreth, whose entire civilization was built on the philosophy that strength was the only honest language, watched the footage with the intense focus of scholars studying a sacred text. Their military analysts pulled it apart frame by frame, cataloging every movement, every decision, every angle of force. Within 48 hours of the incident, the Kreth delegation sent a formal communication to the human platform aboard the Sovereign Meridian. Owen translated it 3 times because he did not believe his first 2 readings. The message, in the oldest and most serious register of the Kreth formal language, expressed what translated with some difficulty as deep and genuine professional admiration. They did not say it the way a person compliments a stranger. They said it the way a soldier salutes someone they have decided is worth saluting. The Thulans, by contrast, were horrified. They were a pacifist species. They had not engaged in organized violence in over 2,000 years, and they were proud of this in the way that only species who have fully forgotten what violence costs tend to be. They issued a public statement calling the incident a dangerous escalation. They called for calm. They called for dialogue. They called for a review of security protocols in the central chamber. No one paid very much attention to them. The Volcari said nothing publicly for the first 2 days. This was unusual. The Volcari were not a quiet people. They were politically active, verbally precise, and almost never without an opinion. Their silence was noticed by every intelligence division in the Conclave, and most of those divisions correctly guessed that the Volcari were doing what they always did when they went quiet. They were reading. Counselor Zhith of the Volcari Diplomatic Corps sat at her desk for most of those 2 days and read. She was not young. She had spent 40 years in the conclave in various capacities: junior analyst, regional advisor, senior diplomat, and now full counselor. She had seen species rise and fall. She had watched alliances form and collapse. She considered herself a realist, which meant she believed that the universe operated according to certain principles that were consistent, observable, and not particularly kind. She had known about humans in the way that most senior conclave members knew about humans. She had read the initial survey reports when humanity made first contact. She had voted, without much interest, on the motion to grant them observer status. She had filed their entry in her personal notes as new arrival, pre-industrial in galactic terms, low threat profile, likely to assimilate gradually. She had been wrong. She opened the Earth files, not the diplomatic files, not the contact reports, or the trade proposals, or the cultural summaries written for the convenience of other species. She opened the old files, the raw survey data collected by conclave observation probes before humanity had ever known it was being watched. The ecological reports, the biological assessments, the atmospheric and geological histories. She read about Earth. She read about the gravity, heavier than the Volcari homeworld by a meaningful margin, which meant that every organism on Earth had been built to carry more weight just to stand up. She read about the disease history, a constant, rolling war between biological organisms that had been ongoing for billions of years, producing immune systems of remarkable complexity. She read about the predator density, the sheer number of things on Earth that had been at various points in its history, trying to eat humans or be eaten by them or compete with them for the same resources. She read about the ice ages. She read about the volcanic periods. She read about the mass extinction events, and the fact that after each one, something on Earth had survived, adapted, and eventually filled the empty space left behind. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Then she called up the medical report on the 5-second incident, the one the conclave's physicians had filed, the one that noted Diane Farrow's movements as biomechanically inconsistent. She read through it carefully. She looked at the part where the reviewing physician had listed Diane's physical measurements: height, mass, recorded muscle density, bone structure. She looked at the footage again. She watched Varak's guard reach for Diane and miss. She watched Diane move past 2 trained Raveshi soldiers as if they were furniture. She watched Varak go to his knees. Then she opened a file she had never had reason to open before: the full human military history archive. She had access to it because senior counselors had access to everything. She had simply never looked at it, because there had never seemed to be a reason. She started at the beginning. She read for 6 hours without stopping. What she found was not what she had expected to find. She had expected a history of simple tribal conflict, the kind of low-level territorial violence that most young species pass through before they develop the technology to either destroy themselves or calm down. What she found instead was something more complicated and more troubling. Humans had been in a state of near-constant organized conflict throughout most of their recorded history. Not always everywhere, not always at the same scale, but the pattern was consistent and clear. They fought, they lost, they adapted, they fought again with whatever they had learned. More importantly, she found the details of what they had done to survive. They had walked across continents on foot, in conditions that would hospitalize most species. They had built shelters in temperatures that fell below the functional limits of Volcari cold tolerance. They had eaten things that were actively trying to kill them, and developed ways to make those things safe. They had crossed open water, on constructed vessels, through storms that destroyed those vessels regularly, and kept crossing anyway. Every time the environment had said no, they had asked the question again. She read about their wars with a growing sense of unease that she did not try to suppress, because Zeeth had not become a counselor by ignoring her instincts. The thing that troubled her most was not the scale of the violence. The thing that troubled her was the recovery time. Species that went to war on the scale that humans had gone to war tended to stay damaged for generations. The social structures collapsed. The population declined. The will to continue eroded. Humans had rebuilt after every single one. Not slowly, not in the passive way of something that simply waits for time to pass. They had rebuilt actively, deliberately, and with what she could only describe as an almost unreasonable refusal to accept that the damage was permanent. She closed the file. She sat quietly for a while. Then she wrote a short note to her assistant, requesting that a private meeting be arranged with the human delegation before the Varath challenge took place. Not an official meeting, not a formal session, just a conversation. She also wrote, in her personal record, the one she kept in a system that was not connected to the Conclave archive, a single line that she would later be glad she had written down, because it captured something true in the moment before she had time to second-guess it. The line was, "We have been watching the wrong things about them." Meanwhile, aboard the Sovereign Meridian, Aaron was sitting in the small room that served as the human delegation's quarters, reading the same challenge documents Owen had translated, and thinking about the Varath. Owen was at the table, still on his devices, but slower now. The manic pace of the first day had given way to something more measured and worried. Diane was doing push-ups in the corner of the room. She had been doing them for 20 minutes. She had not broken rhythm once. Aaron looked at her for a moment. It was not really a question. "I'm focused," she said, without pausing. "What's the difference?" She thought about it for 3 push-ups. "Nervous means you're not sure you can handle what's coming," she said. "Focused means you're making sure you can." Aaron nodded slowly. Outside the viewport, the star burned on in steady, indifferent gold light. In rooms and chambers and intelligence offices across the galaxy, the footage kept playing on loop. And species that had never thought seriously about humanity were beginning, very quietly, to revise their assumptions. The arena was being prepared. The galaxy was still watching. And in the corner of a small human delegation room, Diane Farrow kept doing push-ups, with the calm, patient steadiness of someone who had absolutely no intention of losing. The Hind alien commander slapped a Deathworlder. 5 seconds later, the galaxy saw his head roll. Part 4. The Weight of 43 Worlds. The arena had not been used in 11 years. It had been carved from the interior of a captured asteroid, a rough, old, honest space, with walls of dark gray rock and seating cut directly into the stone in rising rings around a flat central floor. The floor itself was pale and smooth, polished by centuries of use. There were no decorations, no banners, no announcements played over a speaker system. The arena did not need any of those things. It had a kind of weight to it that came from its history, and that weight was enough. It held 10,000 spectators. On the day of the Varath, it was full. Counselor Zeeth sat in the Vokari section, high in the 3rd ring, and looked down at the floor below. She had spoken with Aaron the previous evening, the quiet, informal conversation she had requested. It had lasted an hour. He had been polite, thoughtful, and careful with his words. She had asked him how humanity had prepared for the Varath. He had said that they had not prepared in the way she might expect. They had not studied Draveshi combat techniques, or reviewed footage of previous Varath contests, or designed a specific tactical approach. She had asked what they had done instead. He had said, "We trusted the person." She had thought about that conversation many times since. Now she looked at the floor of the arena and waited. The Draveshi entered first, as was their right as the challenging party. Varrock walked in at the front of his group, moving with the kind of deliberate steadiness that told every watching eye that he was in control of himself, if nothing else. He had recovered his posture, if not his pride. He took his place in the formal challenger's position, at the edge of the floor, and stood without speaking. Behind him came his chosen champion. His name was Gruul. The reaction in the arena when Gruul walked onto the floor was audible. A murmur moved through 10,000 beings like a wave. Even the Kreth, who had seen a great many things in their lives, made a sound that their language did not have a specific word for. Something between acknowledgement and appetite. Gruul was 8 feet tall. He was broad in the way that walls are broad, not threatening in the active sense, but simply occupying space in a way that left less of it for everything else. He had won 26 consecutive Varath contests over a career that spanned 4 decades. He wore no armor for the contest, which was the Draveshi tradition. The Varath was a test of the body, not the equipment around it. He did not look at the human section of the seats. He did not look at anything in particular. He simply stood on the floor and breathed, slowly and evenly, like something that had nothing to prove because it had already proven everything it needed to. Then the human delegation entered. Aaron walked in front, with Owen at his side. They moved to the formal respondent's position, across the floor from Varrock. Aaron stood straight, with his hands at his sides, and looked at Varrock without expression. Then Diane came in behind them. She was wearing her standard clothing. No armor, because the Varath did not permit it, and because she did not ask for it. She walked across the stone floor of the arena in the same way she always walked, not slowly, not quickly, just with that particular economy of movement that she always had, as if every step was exactly the length it needed to be, and no more. She stopped beside Aaron and looked across the floor at Gruul. Gruul, for the first time, looked back at her. His 3 eyes moved across her height, her mass, her build. He was performing the same unconscious calculation that every species with a history of physical conflict performs when meeting a potential opponent. He was measuring her against what he knew. What he concluded was not visible on his face. The formal proceedings were brief. The conclave's officiators stated the terms. The contest ends when one participant cannot continue. No weapons. No assistance from outside the floor. The result is final and legally binding under Varath protocol. Both sides acknowledged. Diane stepped onto the floor. Gruul stepped onto the floor. They faced each other. Jith leaned forward in her seat. The first 30 seconds were not what the audience expected. Gruul did not charge. He moved carefully, circling, watching. He had fought 26 times in this arena. He knew better than to assume. He watched the way she moved, the way she held her weight, the small signals that a body gives when it is preparing to do something. Diane moved to meet him. What happened in the next several minutes was very difficult to describe in the way that most physical contests are described, because it did not follow a simple shape. It was not a series of clean exchanges. It was complicated and ungraceful and honest in the way that real physical confrontation always is, which is to say, it was nothing like what anyone watching had imagined it would be. Gruul was stronger. This was a fact, not an opinion. When he landed a strike on Diane's left side, the first real hit of the contest, catching her below the ribs, it moved her. It moved her sideways and backward, and she did not pretend otherwise. She went with it, used it, turned the movement into distance, and came back. That was the first time the arena noticed something. She came back. Gruul hit her again, harder, in the shoulder. 3,000 beings in the upper rings let out a sound that was, across every species present, the universal noise for expecting something to end. She steadied herself. She came back. There is a specific thing that happens in a physical contest when one party realizes that their hits are landing and the other party is not stopping. It is not a conscious thought, exactly. It is more like a change in the temperature of the moment, a creeping awareness that the rules of the situation are not what they appeared to be. Gruul had hit her twice now with genuine force. By the standards of every species he had ever fought, she should have been finished. She was not finished. She came back at him low and fast, and found the place where his armor would have been if he had been wearing any, and she worked there with the focused, purposeful attention of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. She was not as strong as him. She was not trying to be. She was trying to find the specific angles and sequences that converted what strength she had into outcomes that mattered. She found them. She was bleeding from a cut above her eye. She had 2 ribs that were making a sound when she breathed, that Owen, watching from the edge of the floor, found deeply alarming. Gruel had thrown her once, actually lifted her from the floor and thrown her, and she had hit the stone hard enough that the sound of it made the Thulin observers cover the transparent panels of their containers. She had gotten up. Gruel stood over her in the moment after the throw and looked at her on the floor, and he waited. He was not being cruel, he was being accurate. He had thrown opponents harder than this, and they had not gotten up. He was waiting for the information he expected the situation to provide. Diane got her hands under her. She pushed herself up. She looked at him. She smiled. It was not a defiant smile, or a brave smile, or any kind of performance. It was simply the expression of someone who had arrived at a place inside themselves where the outcome had already been decided, and the rest was just a question of time and effort. That was the moment. Later, beings who had been present would describe it differently. The Kreth would say they saw it in her eyes. Jeeth would say she saw it in the way Gruel's weight shifted. A fraction of a change, almost invisible, but real. Owen would say he did not see anything, because he had his eyes closed. What it was, simply, was hesitation. Gruel hesitated. He had thrown her hard enough to end a fight. She had gotten up and smiled at him, and for a fraction of a second, a sliver of time that did not seem like it should be enough to matter, he paused, while she did not. She closed the distance. She found the places she had been working toward for the entire contest. She applied what she had. And Gruel, 26-time champion of the Verath, went down. He went down hard. He went down in a way that was final and clear and required no interpretation. He did not get back up. The arena was absolutely silent. Not a sound. Not from 10,000 beings of dozens of species, all of whom had been making noise at various volumes for the last several minutes. The silence lasted for 4 full seconds. Then, the Kreth delegation began a rhythmic sound, a deep, low percussion made with their primary limbs, building slowly. It was a sound Jeeth had heard once before, at the end of a battle she had observed as a young analyst. It was the sound the Kreth made to honor something they considered genuinely great. The officiator stepped onto the floor. He announced the result. Diane walked back to where Aaron was standing. She was breathing carefully. Owen immediately produced a medical kit and began working on the cut above her eye, talking quietly and quickly in the way he did when he was nervous. She looked straight ahead. Across the floor, Varrock stood very still. Under Draveshi law, what happened next was automatic. It did not require a vote or a ruling or any deliberation. When a Varroth champion falls, the commander who named them bears the formal consequence. The tradition was old and absolute, and had been designed by the Draveshi themselves, in a time before the Conclave, to ensure that leaders took the weight of the decisions they made. A subordinate Draveshi officer walked forward and stopped in front of Varrock. The officer's voice was flat and formal, and carried to every corner of the arena. He named the result. He named the consequence. He reached up to Varrock's collar, where the layered insignia of a high commander were pinned in dark metal, and he removed them one by one. Each one made a small sound as it came free. The officer placed them on a flat ceremonial surface and stepped back. Varrock stood where he was. He was no longer High Commander Varrock. He was, under the language of the Draveshi tradition, returned to zero. The authority he had carried into this room, the authority of 43 conquered worlds, of decades of command, of a position that had made the entire galactic conclave step carefully around him, had rolled from his shoulders in the space of a short ceremony on a polished stone floor. The galaxy had come here to watch humanity be put in its place. It had watched something else instead. Jeeth sat back in her seat. She looked at the floor, where Diane was letting Owen clean the cut above her eye, with the patient tolerance of someone who finds the fuss unnecessary. She looked at Aaron, who was looking at nothing in particular with a face that gave very little away. She looked at the empty space on Varrock's collar where the insignia had been. She thought about the lines she had written in her personal record 2 days ago. She thought, yes, that was the right observation. We were watching the wrong things. She was already thinking about what she was going to say in the emergency session. Alien Commander slapped a Deathworlder. 5 seconds later, the galaxy saw his head roll. Part 5. What the galaxy learned that day. The emergency session was called the morning after the Varath. It was not a small meeting. Every delegation aboard the Sovereign Meridian sent a representative, and several delegations that had not been present for the original incident requested emergency communication access so they could observe from their home systems. The central chamber, which 2 days ago had watched a human be struck in the face and expected nothing of interest to follow, was full again. Aaron sat at the human platform and waited. He had slept 4 hours. His face was calm. He had eaten breakfast and spoken to Owen about the agenda, and spoken to Diane about how she was feeling, and she had said she was fine. And he had looked at the careful way she was sitting, and guessed that 2 of her ribs were cracked. But he had not pushed the point, because she had not wanted him to. Diane was present. She had not asked to stay behind. Owen had quietly attempted to suggest that she might want to rest, and she had looked at him in a way that ended the conversation. The session opened. The first item on the agenda was the outcome of the Varath and its legal implications. The officiator confirmed the result. He confirmed the formal stripping of Varrock's command rank. He confirmed, in the dry procedural language of the conclave, that under the Varath protocol, as invoked by the Dravshi party, the result was final, binding, and entered into the permanent record. Then Councillor Jeeth of the Vokari requested the floor. She stood and looked around the chamber for a moment before she spoke. She was not a dramatic speaker in the usual sense. She did not perform her words. She simply said them with the quiet precision of someone who had thought about them for a long time, and was confident they were correct. She said that she had spent the last 2 days reviewing the full Earth archive. She said that she had come to a conclusion which she suspected several of her colleagues had also reached, and which she believed the conclave needed to address formally. She said that humanity had been granted observer status on the assumption that they were a young and limited species, requiring time and guidance before they could participate meaningfully in galactic affairs. She said that assumption was wrong. Not wrong in a small way. Wrong in the specific way that an assumption is wrong when it is based on looking at the surface of something and believing you have understood the whole of it. Humanity had been assessed on their technology, which was new, on their interstellar reach, which was short, on their size and their age as a spacefaring civilization, both of which were modest. No one had looked seriously at where they came from, or what it had taken for them to get here. She said she had looked. She described what she had found in plain terms, without dramatic language. A planet of unusual difficulty, a history of survival that would have ended most species several times over. A biology built for endurance in conditions that were genuinely hostile. A psychology that under pressure did not collapse, it focused. A capacity for pain tolerance that was, she said, not a boast or a legend, but a documented measurable fact that the medical report from the chamber incident had confirmed, and which the Varath had confirmed again in front of 10,000 witnesses. We have spent 3 centuries being afraid of the Draveshi because they were the most powerful force we knew. We spent that same time not being afraid of humans because they were small and new and easy to dismiss. She paused. I am suggesting to this body that we made an error in our assessment, and that the correct response to an error is to correct it. She moved that humanity be elevated from observer status to full conclave membership, effective immediately. The chamber debated for 2 hours. The motion passed. The margin surprised Aaron. He had expected it to be close, perhaps 1 or 2 votes clear. The majority was wide enough that Owen, watching the vert tally appear on his translation device, made a quiet sound of surprise and then looked embarrassed about it. Aaron accepted the result on behalf of humanity, with a short and direct statement that thanked the conclave for its decision and committed the human delegation to participating in full good faith. He did not make it long. He did not want to make it long. He thought that long speeches in moments like this tended to get in the way of the moment itself. After the session, in the corridor outside the central chamber, Counselor Zeeth stopped him. "I would like to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead," Aaron said. "When you accepted the Varath challenge, you did it immediately, without consulting your team, without requesting time to consider." She watched his face. "Why?" Aaron thought about it. "Because there wasn't really a choice," he said. "We couldn't refuse and still mean anything in this room. And if we were going to do it, doing it without hesitation was the only way to do it that made sense." He paused. "Also, I had already looked at Diane, and I knew." Zeeth was quiet for a moment. "You knew she would win," she said. "I knew she would not stop," he said, "which isn't always the same thing, but in a Varath, it turns out it is." Zeeth thought about that. "Your species is going to be very difficult," she said, not unkindly. "Probably," Aaron said. "We come by it honestly." The asteroid belt was formally awarded to the human delegation 3 days later. The ruling cited the Varath outcome, the conclave membership vote, and 3 separate precedents in resource law that Aaron had been trying to cite when Varrock interrupted him. The HFY delegation, now without their high commander, who had left the sovereign meridian quietly and without ceremony, did not raise an objection. The human team boarded their shuttle and began the journey home. In the back of the shuttle, Owen sat at his table and started writing. He had been making notes for 2 days. He knew what he wanted to say. He had the shape of it clearly in his mind, and he wanted to get it down before the journey home smoothed the sharp edges of what he had seen and felt in that chamber, in that arena. He wrote for 3 hours without stopping. What he produced was the foundation of what would later become a paper, eventually considered the founding text of a new academic field studying human behavior in interspecies contexts. The paper argued that humanity's first genuine act of galactic diplomacy was not a speech or a treaty or a trade agreement. It was a series of physical facts that expressed, more clearly than any formal statement could, the nature of the species doing the expressing. The paper's final line was, "Earth did not produce diplomats, it produced survivors who eventually learned to talk." It was a line that got quoted, in the years that followed, more than almost anything else written about that day. Diane sat near the viewport of the shuttle and looked at the stars. She had a bandage above her eye, and she was breathing in the slow, careful way of someone who is managing discomfort without complaining about it. She had refused the stronger painkillers the conclave's medical staff had offered, on the grounds that she did not like the way they made her feel slow. A reporter from one of the conclave's media networks had requested an interview before they left. Diane had agreed to a short one. The reporter had asked her many questions, and she had answered most of them briefly. Toward the end, the reporter had asked her how she felt in the moment she decided to move in the chamber, when she crossed those 5 feet and decided to act. Diane had considered the question. She said she did not remember deciding. She had just moved. The situation had presented itself, and her body had responded before her mind had finished framing the question. The reporter had asked, "Were you afraid?" Diane had been quiet for a moment. "Not of him," she said. The reporter had asked, "Then of what?" Diane had looked at the reporter for a moment. "Of not being fast enough," she said. Aaron, sitting across the shuttle from her now, looked at her profile against the viewport and the stars. He thought about everything that had happened in the last 5 days. He thought about the chamber, and the sound of the strike, and the silence afterward. He thought about the 5 seconds, and the arena, and the sound the Kreth had made. He thought about what Zeeth had said, "Your species is going to be very difficult," and he thought she was right, and he thought it was not the worst thing anyone had ever said about them. He opened his report document and began to write. He wrote about the incident and its causes, and its outcomes. He wrote about the legal implications of the Varath, and the political significance of the membership vote. He wrote about Varak, and the asteroid belt, and the structure of the conclave, and what humanity's new position within it might mean going forward. Near the end of the report, he wrote a single line that was not quite in the formal style of the rest of it. He wrote it anyway, because it was true, and because he thought someone should say it plainly. The line was, "We were not trying to make a point. We were just being ourselves." Apparently, that was enough. The report was classified for 15 years. When it was eventually declassified and released to the public, the line that got quoted most often was that one. 6 months after the incident, the Krech sent a gift to humanity's home government. It arrived in a small sealed container, carried by a formal Kreth diplomatic courier, which was itself notable because the Kreth had never sent a formal diplomatic courier to anyone they did not consider a peer. Inside the container was a single piece of polished dark stone, a fragment from the surface of the first world the Kreth had ever conquered, which they kept as a symbol of the beginning of their history. They had never given a fragment to anyone before. The attached message was written in the oldest formal register of the Kreth language. Owen translated it himself, and then read it 3 times to make sure he had it right. It said, "We see you now. We should have looked sooner." The galaxy, as it turned out, had spent a very long time being afraid of the wrong things, and dismissing the wrong things, and watching the wrong things. It had seen a species arrive small and quiet and new, and it had looked at the surface, the modest ships, the short history, the soft bodies, and it had filed them away as something that would eventually either grow up or fade out. It had not looked at the world that made them. It had not looked at the 4 billion years of pressure that had shaped every bone and reflex and instinct in their bodies. It had not looked at the history, the ice and the fire and the disease, and the wars and the collapses and the rebuilding, always the rebuilding, always that unreasonable and relentless refusal to accept that the damage was the end of the story. It had not understood until a single human woman crossed 5 feet of floor in a diplomatic chamber and put a high commander on his knees, that the surface was not the truth. The truth was underneath. The truth was older than the stars most of them were born near. The truth was that humanity had not arrived in the galaxy because conditions had been kind to them. They had arrived in spite of conditions that had never once been kind to them at all.